Good afternoon, everybody. Andrew, how you doing?
Doing good.
Welcome to the Black and White Theology Podcast. Give me a second while I turn down our intro music. Because as I've grown accustomed to, because Andrew does not show up and do the producing,
I'm a busy guy.
I'm doing it all.
I'm a
But
busy
hey,
guy.
but thanks for showing up for the
I'm here.
podcast today.
Well, where's Ron?
Ron had major surgery. He had his chest opened up and had a mass taken out of his chest. So I'm not going to get on Ron today because he's got a legit excuse for not being here. In fact, let me text Ron. This is a see how he's doing. Ron Jones. Here, hold on a second. Andrew and I are podcasting right now. If you want to check it out. All right, we'll see if Ron checks it out. Here, I'll tell him. Feel free to call in if you have any comments. We'll see if we can get Ron from the recovery from his surgery. But from everything that I've heard from him, just through a couple of text messages, for those of you that aren't aware, that the surgery was really, really good. He came through it, and they didn't have to break his sternum. I think there was a concern that they might have to break some bones in his body to get to the mass that was up against his windpipe. They didn't have to do that. It went better than they expected. And now he is home recovering. He's been home recovering for about a couple of weeks now. So he's doing well. We'll see if he responds to my text. And who knows if he did tell me his voice, like he didn't have a voice, like he wasn't able to talk. His breathing was back to 100%, which he said was really cool. And very weird because it's probably been like at least months, if not maybe a year or so, that his breathing hasn't been right. So now that he has full breathing, he said that was weird, but he said it affected his ability to speak and talk. And if you know anything about Ron does a lot of talking. So
yes, he does.
So we'll see if he responds to my text. But no, thank you, Andrew, for showing up and being a part of the podcast once again. So we're on episode 72, and Ron and I, if you've been following along, started what's now become a 3-part series that we started right around Valentine's Day on marriage, love, relationships, and Andrew being single.
Yeah.
So, in the words of the great theologian Beyonce, all the single ladies, that's a Beyonce song,
She
right?
does.
Yeah.
She does say that.
All the single ladies, all the single ladies. So I don't know anything. I don't know the rest of the words of that song.
It's all good. It's okay.
But
it's okay.
She's talking to the single ladies, Andrew. And so I thought this was fitting because Andrew is not a single lady, but he's a single guy. And so we're going to, the goal is not to hook Andrew up with a date, but if that happens through this podcast, then so be it. God works through sovereign means to accomplish his sovereign will in people's lives, even dating and marriage. So, if there is some single ladies out there, that, God's been working in their heart toward marriage and relationship, you can reach out to myself or Ron Jones. And, we'll send you guys out on a beautiful, evening. But it goes through Ron and I first. It's not just gonna be anybody. Right. Like we have standards here.
Yeah, you're looking out. You're looking out.
So anyway, but I do have. It's nice to have you, Andrew, here to talk about singleness from the perspective of someone who has not been married and is single and has navigating the Christian single life. So we're going to delve into that as we wrap up this discussion. Like I said, that started right around Valentine's Day. So it's just about a month ago. And so that being the case, I just want to double check. I'm always nervous that we're talking to nobody.
Right.
I want to make sure that we're
take your time.
Well, are we live streaming Black and White Theology Podcast? It says we are. And it looks like we are. Yep. Everything looks good. Okay. All right. Andrew, how old are you?
26.
26 years old. So you came on staff here when you were 24, right? 24 years old.
So, yeah.
Just almost 2 years ago. It'll be 2 years this May, right? End of May, beginning of June. I guess June. Oh, okay. So end of May, beginning of June. And So when I first met you, a little bit of your story, you were kind of dating. You were
I
in,
guess.
you were in, you were
Kind
in of a kind of a relationship that needed definition,
of.
right? And it got defined,
Yeah,
and you're still single.
I
So,
am.
so we
I
got the
am.
answer to that
We're
that
good.
relationship. And she was a lovely girl,
Oh,
and
yeah, 100%. Yeah.
yeah, she was fantastic, but um, it wasn't God's sovereign will for you. So Andrew dealt with his heartache, wiped his
Okay.
tears. I caught him a couple times in his office,
Well,
just dealing.
that's not true. I'm not gonna lie to the people.
No, Andrew,
But
Andrew took it like a champ. Said, "Hey, this is God's will. I'm going to move on,"
hey,
and he's done so, and has been navigating single life. You graduated college,
mm-hmm.
you got a job as a youth pastor, you moved into an apartment by yourself,
Yeah.
and had some massive changes in your life, right? So just walk us through your story just a little bit about what God has brought you through as a single guy, really the past couple of years since you joined the staff here at Faith, and you spent over a year living by yourself in a
Yeah.
lonely apartment by yourself, and your experiences with that, and where God has you now.
Yeah. So coming here, I stayed with the family for a couple of months and then got my own apartment. And when I got my own apartment, it was the first time ever living by myself. And I remember saying as a kid, I would never want to live by myself.
Yeah.
I mean, as a kid, I would think I'll be married by now, but it is what it is. So I liked it, but there were days where I would say, I feel like I wish there was someone else here. But it's it's interesting. The times where like I wish there was someone else here, and there's times where I'm glad that I'm by myself. And now, right now, I'm living with the family, and it's going well.
Did you ever struggle like with loneliness living by yourself in an apartment, or did you enjoy the bachelor life, having your own space, your own time? You didn't have to report to anybody except for work or whatever.
Yeah,
But
yeah. I
or
mean,
were you like, man, I'm kind of lonely and this kind of sucks?
well, sometimes
Okay.
I was like, oh, man, I'm kind of lonely right now. But
Hmm.
there were, to be honest, most of the time, I'm like, go home and go home, play video games. Don't have to talk to
Hmm.
anybody if I don't want to.
Hmm.
So, it is what it is.
There is something about from a guy's perspective anyway. Sometimes
Yeah.
I've heard this
Yeah,
anyway.
somewhere, right?
Some guys feel this way, that man, it'd be nice to come home and just not have anyone talk to me, and just maybe if I want to watch a movie, watch a movie. If I want to, eat junk food on the couch,
Yeah,
and
no accountability.
binge watch whatever, then I can do that. And but for those of us who are married with children and a family and everything like that, that almost never happens, nor should it happen, because
Mhm.
our priority and our responsibility is our wives, our children. It's not that we can't have me time or whatever
Yeah,
you want to
yeah.
call it, but those moments are few and far between, and that's fine. But I will say there are times when it'd be like, it's been a long day, But
Mhm.
if you're single, you have some freedom to do that.
Yeah.
But you're the type of person though that likes to be around people or doesn't like to be around people.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you would take that introvert extrovert test, it would say I'm like 51% introvert, 49% extrovert,
Hmm.
which is weird because, like, okay, then where does that lie? I like being around people, I like talking to people, but there are times where I'm like, okay, let me go, and sometimes that's kind of rare.
Hmm.
But when it happens, I'm like, oh yeah, I want to just be by
Yeah,
myself.
yeah. I I get that. I'm that way too. I'm introverted with people I'm not comfortable with or
Hmm.
familiar with. I become very extroverted with people that I'm more
Yeah.
comfortable with, and I think certain people, like my wife, are wired to be around people a lot, and get energized, and their cup filled by being around people and having people over, and being
Hmm.
in social environments. Other people, that drains them.
Yeah.
And I kind of find myself, um, I hit a wall at some point when I'm in social
Hmm.
engagements. Like I'm good for a while, and then when I hit that wall, it comes out of nowhere, and I hit that wall, and it's like, Why
I've
is
seen.
yeah. People that know me know exactly what I'm talking about. I always said to my wife when she loves to have people over for dinner and friends, and she just loves that, and she thrives off of that. And I told her, if you like, one time I got up and just started doing the dishes because this family stayed forever, and I was like, they're not going home, so I need to get up and like give them a hint, like
Right.
get out of my house, right? So I got up, I cleaned the dishes, cleaned the kitchen, cleaned the whole table off, cleaned the living room because the little kids were in the house,
Mhm.
put the kids to bed. They were still there.
Yeah.
And afterwards, Steph's like, Doug, that was kind of rude. I'm like, them staying in my house till 11 o'clock at night was rude. They need to take a hint. So I said to her, if I get up and start doing the dishes, that means I'm maxed. I'm done. Right.
Right.
And I'll tell that even to people sometimes, like, hey, if I get up and do the dishes, don't be offended.
Mhm.
I'm just doing my thing. So anyway, so my wife got this sign that she hangs outside this house that says welcome. But then underneath it says, depends on who you are and how long you stay. And she got that for me. So
Mm.
I understand people are different, wired in different ways. To some people, are like, oh, I could be alone and be fine. Other people are like, no, I hate being alone. Just the
Mhm.
loneliness kills me. And so therefore being single for some people is very difficult
Yeah.
because maybe they are wired for relationships, for being around people. We're all wired for relationships. Ron and I
Mhm.
talked about
Yeah.
that 2 episodes ago. But they need relationships. They need to be around people. Other people are more okay to kind of be by themselves. It seems like you're kind of in between, right?
Right.
And so, um, being single, being in ministry, you were living by yourself. Now you're living with a family from the church,
Mhm.
um, and that's probably a little different dynamic as well.
Yeah.
It's cheaper
Oh yeah. Yes, it is.
for sure,
Definitely cheaper.
but you also have built-in kind of like a family environment.
Mhm.
You've got people around that are going to be a part of your life when
Yep.
you come home, that you can talk to and things like that. And I think some people that thrive off of that or really need that struggle with being single, especially if they're living by themselves.
Mhm.
And I've known a number of single people who it becomes a real battle. And then there's some there's a strong desire for marriage, right? So for some it's just companionship, it's being around people. I need that. Other people are like, no, I really want to be married. And so we're gonna delve into what the Bible says about singleness. There's a particular passage of scripture in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and Paul writes about marriage, and he writes about singleness.
Mhm.
And so we're going to go right there, and let's just read um, read what Paul says here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Let's begin reading in verse 6. It says this. Um, Now, as a concession, not a command. So it's interesting how Paul starts that. He says this isn't like God telling you this, but it's a it's a he he says a concession, right? So it's an option. He says, I wish that all were as I myself am. And I'm getting a little flicker on my iPad here. Hopefully that's probably being sent to the. Hold on a second. That could be bothersome for some people. If it's sorry about the flicker. If you're looking online, I'm not sure why it's doing that, but I thought I had a cool system set up where I could cast to my Apple TV, then
Hey,
the
it's
Apple
okay.
TV to my streaming device, and anyway, give me 1 second. I'm gonna plug. I think the cable.
We all make mistakes, Doug. We all make mistakes. Now we have people just out here wanting to hear about what's going to happen in this podcast, and we're not talking about
I
anything.
know, but well, sorry if it flickers, but you're gonna have to deal with it. So he says, as a command, not as a command, but as a concession. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each. Sorry, I'm trying to do everything, produce and host. But each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. So very interestingly, out of the gate, Paul talks about a gift. He says everyone has a gift, talking within the context of marriage but also now him switching and talking about singleness. You say, well, Doug, how do we know he's talking about being single? Well, he says, because I wish that all were as I myself am, and Paul was single, and well, how do we know Paul was single? Because he's going to tell us later in the text. So he's going to switch from talking about marriage to singleness. And he says, I wish all were as I am, meaning Paul says, I wish everyone was single. All right, that's why he says, this is my opinion, right? And so what's hard about this text is even though it's Holy Scripture, inspired from God, inerrant, right? We believe all of those things. Yet within that, we interpret this, Paul saying, this isn't a direct command from God. In other words, Paul's saying marriage isn't commanded and singleness isn't commanded. Each one has his own gift, right? And so I take that to mean that for some, being single is a gift. Now, I know a lot of people look at it as a curse in our culture, especially if people really want to get married. But there are some that, like Paul, were perfectly fine to stay single, right? And in fact, Paul was like, I wish everyone could be single like me. But each one has his own gift. Some people have that gift of what we'll call singleness, and some people don't. One of one kind, one of another. And so then he says, to the unmarried, and to the widows, I say it is good for them to remain single. Right? So if you're unmarried, Andrew, or if you're widowed and you've lost your spouse, it is good to remain single. It's a good thing. And then Paul says, as I am. So there's where we get Paul's identification of singleness and him being like, hey, I'm single and it's great, right? It's great. And so, hey, here's the advice. Paul's like, hey, if Paul was sitting here with you, Andrew, you'd say, listen, it'd be great if you stayed single like I am. Like he kind of advocates for singleness here. But then he says this, so there's the but. If they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion, right? And so basically he's talking about sexual purity there, right? He's saying, listen, I get it. And Paul's like, I get it. If you can't exercise self-control with regards to sexual purity, then get married and make babies, right? It's better to do that than to, and this is translated, burn with passion, right? And so that is the idea of not being able to control sexual desire, which sexual desire is a God-given desire. Ron and I talked about the idea of first century kind of Greco-Roman views of sexuality, which are very similar to ours today. The body is meant for food, and the stomach is meant for food, and the food for the stomach. And so the body was meant for sexual activity. Therefore, it's just a biological function. If you missed that, listen to that, our description of that from last time. The sexual act and the one flesh relationships is about way more than just biology, right? There's a lot of really, really a lot more deeper things happening there. So we know that based on what Paul is saying here is that sex is reserved for marriage. So therefore, it's better to marry than to really, really struggle with, sexual impurity. Not that getting married takes away people's struggle with, lust. Okay, so lust, do you think that that's what Paul's saying here? It's not. I've counseled many, many people who struggle with lust even though they're in a marriage relationship. However, a healthy marriage relationship with healthy sexual activity is a beautiful, healthy thing. It's a great thing. And so Paul says, listen, it's better to marry than to burn. So what he's saying is, listen, some people can live a life of singleness and be like, hey, I'm good to be celibate. Other people are like, I could never do that, right? And Paul says, yeah, that. So the gift I think he's talking about is the gift that verse 8 kind of points to, and the idea that if you can exercise self-control, and I've known single guys who and women who are like, yeah, I'm perfectly fine and content, and God's given me that contentedness, and I don't necessarily battle with lust and sexual immorality in the way that maybe other single people do. So therefore, I'm good to not be married if that's what God has for me. Um, and so then he goes on to say to the married, and I'll go back to my screen here, but it's flickering and quite annoying, I think. To the married, I give this charge. Notice what he says in parentheses, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. So these are situations of when there is a marriage, but there's been divorce. So if a husband leaves his wife, he says, and he recommends, this isn't a command, right? We know um, if if she leaves or if he leaves her, hey, I recommend you stay unmarried or else be reconciled to your husband. But in the end, the husband should not divorce his wife. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord. Again, he's qualifying this as his opinion and his advice, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, she should not divorce her. So this is the unbelieving husband-wife relationship. So I want to park here because I know some of our listeners are in this situation. Hey, what if my spouse isn't a Christian? What do I do? Well, Paul says, if a woman has a husband who's unbelieving and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. Stay married. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of the husband. That doesn't mean that if you're married to someone who's a Christian, that makes them a Christian. That's not what Paul's saying. Paul says, if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. So in other words, if your unsafe spouse leaves you because you're a Christian or they're done, um, you haven't sinned. I take that to mean you can be remarried. God has called you to peace. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? How do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? And so, what Paul is getting at here is if you're in a relationship where the spouse isn't a Christian, then stay married. But if they leave you, you're not bound by that marriage anymore. And I believe you can get remarried. But he says, stay together if you can, because your marriage to this unbelieving partner may be the very thing that draws them to Christ. I think that's what Paul's saying here. But then he goes back and to kind of talking through singleness, but he says, listen, verse 17, only let each person live the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. So God has called some to marriage, some has called some to singleness. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. For neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. So, interestingly enough, he's talking about this within the context of marriage and relationships, being single, being married. And so I would argue that this goes against the Roman Catholic teaching of the sacrament of marriage, and that Paul says, if neither circumcision nor uncircumcision avails to anything, then neither being married nor single avails to anything. That's the point he's making, right? So marriage and singleness do not make you more or less spiritual or more or less accepted by God, but live as you're called. Were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who was called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who was free when he is called as a bondservant of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not be bondservants of men. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, let him there remain. So he kind of goes off on these two illustrations of the bondservant, the circumcision. But keep in mind, he's talking about all of this in the context of married and unmarried, single or married. So his illustration is the bondservant. His illustration is the circumcision. But the point he's making is, if God's called you to be single, be single. If God's called you to be married, be married. That's his point. And then he gets back to singleness here in verse 25. He says this. Now concerning the betrothed. So these are the single who are betrothed. I have no command from the Lord, but but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. So here's my advice again, Paul says. I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Don't seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Don't seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you from that. Okay. Andrew. Paul says if you are married, stay married, right? In fact, his language here, are you bound to a wife? Don't seek to be free. So it almost seems like Paul's like kind of down on marriage, like the old ball and chain, But he says, are you free from a wife? I don't think he's degrading marriage here. This is just the language he was using. Are you free from a wife? Don't seek a wife. So, Andrew, you're free from a wife. I am not free from a wife. Okay?
If you want to put it that way.
Well, that's the way Paul puts it. So I should not seek to be freed from my wife, nor would I want to. I love my wife and I love being married to her. So Paul says, Andrew, are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. So how do you as a single Christian man interact with that text right there and Paul's advice to you?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting text because what do you do if you do want to get married? Are you living in sin?
So
but this is a recommendation from Paul.
Right. So Paul says you haven't sinned if you do get married, but then he says I would recommend that you don't get married.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Right. And if we go on, he kind of gives reasons why, right? He says in verse 28, let me bring it back up on the screen here. Verse 28, if you do marry, you have not sinned. Okay, so, all right, that's good. If a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry, he says, will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you that. This is what I mean, brothers. What do you mean, Paul? Paul says, well, let me tell you what I mean. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none. Let those who mourn as though they were not mourning. Those who rejoice as they were not rejoicing. Those who buy as though they had no goods. Those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away. What are you talking about, Paul? Verse 32. I just want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord, but the married man is anxious about the worldly things, how to please his wife. His interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit, but the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. So Paul gets at it right there, right? He's like, listen, if you're single, you have undivided devotion. So walk us through as a single person and give advice to any single people out there how to navigate being single as a Christian when you feel like you don't have the gift of singleness, that you feel like, no, I really would like to get married. I don't think God's given me this deep contentedness to be single. How would you advise men or women who are in that situation but trying to follow God?
Yeah, I would say a question that has to be asked is, are you content with your walk with the Lord? Are you content with your relationship with God? Because again, there was times where I remember I was really thinking, man, I really wish I was getting married. I wish I was getting married. I remember I was in college and my junior year, some people were saying, hey, man, you need to get on it. You need to get on it. And I'm like, what do you mean? Like, we're about to graduate. I'm like, it's about to happen. If you don't get married before you graduate, you never know. I'm like, what happens if I don't get married? And they're like, and they're saying what they're saying. But I mean, I'm not married. I'm doing something that I love doing with ministry. And hearing what Paul was saying, I'm not saying I'm leaving, but let's just say God said, hey, I want you to be a missionary now in foreign country. I don't have to ask anyone. I can just go.
Yeah.
So you definitely have more freedom to do things for the Lord, but if you look at it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think you're spot on in the fact that what Paul is saying is if you're single, you have more freedom to do more ministry, more things for God than if you're married. To the illustration you brought up, I can't go home tonight and be like, you know what, I'm gonna go live in Mozambique for a year and work with the tribes people there.
Yeah.
Or I'm gonna join this organization that's doing missions work here, and I'm just gonna go and go on an adventure and reach people and be involved in helping the poor. I cannot do that. If I said that to my wife, there would be major problems. Why? Because what Paul said is true. I'm
Mhm.
anxious about the things of the world, how to please my wife. I have responsibilities toward my wife and my children that I can't just give up. You, on the other hand, could,
Right.
if you wanted to, come and say, "Hey, here's my 2 weeks notice. I'm going to
Going to
do this."
Madagascar,
Yeah,
you know?
and God's called me to this, and I'm gonna use it. So I think the first kind of piece of advice, I hear you saying two things. One,
Mhm.
um, there may be a longing and a desire for marriage companionship there, even as Paul says, even the sexual relationship part of it, right? However, try to be content and let Jesus be enough. Number
Yeah.
one,
Yeah.
right? So let's park there for a second. How do you practically kind of walk that road, and when you have a desire and you're lonely and you're struggling with being single, how do you learn to let Jesus be kind of enough?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that you brought up earlier, we are made for relationships.
Hmm.
So if you're not married, you still need the community aspect. You
Yep.
need godly community. People want to encourage you in your walk. We still need that, whether you're married or not. But at the same time, um, when you get married, granted, I'm not married, does that change your personal reading time with God? Does that change your prayer life in the sense you just stop doing it? You still need to do those things. So growing in your relationship with God is still important whether you're single or you're married, and you just need that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
So if there's someone that's single, struggling,
mhm,
Jesus is enough, right?
yep,
And you believe that, but oftentimes what I tell people is what we believe to be true doesn't always match what we're feeling
yeah,
inside, right? So sometimes our theology isn't quite matching up with our emotions,
mhm,
especially when we're struggling in the flesh to really believe that Jesus is enough. So I think one of the things you said is really helpful. I think uh, the pursuit of biblical Christian community
mhm,
while single is absolutely vital
yep,
because you, through other Christians, experience the presence of Christ and learn that He is enough, right? And so, if there is singleness yet loneliness, there needs to be a pursuit of biblical community, whatever that looks like. And I would say this: don't wait around for the married people or the other people in the church to, no one invites me over.
yep,
I'm in my apartment by myself every night. I don't like. You need to be proactive in that.
yeah,
And so, as someone who's married and been married for almost 25 years now, having kids, yeah, sometimes it's easy as a married person to not see the single people or identify with the single people in our church and what they might be going through. So I would challenge you, if you're married, don't overlook the single people in the church. They need that community, that need mentorship. They need people to pour into them. So don't overlook them if you're married, don't overlook them. And then I would say to those who are single, like yourself, if you're struggling with finding community, you need to either create community yourself. You need to
yeah,
be proactive. You need to invite people over. You need to join a small group. You need to take the lead with your own
mhm,
life, right? And experience the presence of Christ through the covenant community. So I think that's huge and
yep,
massively important. And I see a lot of single young people in their 20s or whatever, even into their 30s, just struggling. And I get it. There are days in which it's super lonely, and you're like, I just want to share my life with somebody. I want
yeah,
to be with somebody, and yet maybe there's not a pursuit of biblical community. So what do?
yeah,
You end up. I know some people end up giving in to temptation and struggling with things like pornography and sexual addiction and stuff like that to kind of fill that hole and that gap, or they start settling for relationships that are not healthy for them. So I'm curious to hear from you, from your time, let's say from graduating high school, through
mm,
college to where you are now. Talk about the importance of how relationships have impacted you, and kind of share your journey through finding biblical community that actually helped you as a single young man.
yeah. After high school, I mean, if you don't know me, I've been to a billion colleges, so
What, like three?
yeah, well, 4
That was
actually,
it, four? Okay.
yeah. So when I first graduated high school, I had my friends I went to high school with. We all went to the same college, and I mean, it was great for the time being. Granted, my relationship with God wasn't great.
Mhm.
Um, Left, went to community college. Didn't really like that because I didn't have that community just right there.
Yep.
Then I went to Bible college, went to Cairn University for 2 years, and then I had the youth group that I helped out with. The youth leaders there, they were great. Did not hang out with them a lot outside, but when I did, it was a great time. Now they're older, married, so they're like, okay, well, what about the people like me in the sense where I'm not married and they are? So what do I do now? And I struggled with that for a little bit. But I remember working at High Point Camp, and this was very interesting to me in the sense of seeing biblical community with people my age. We're in the same stage of life. We're all in college, and I'm like, oh, this is different.
Mhm.
This is interesting.
Yep.
And I saw that community. It was great. And then I leave, go back to school, and I have to go create it.
Mhm.
Now, creating it is hard. So you try to do it, it doesn't really work out for, you try to do it for a month. Oh, doesn't work. I'm just going to stop doing it.
What'd you try to do? Just try and gather?
Yeah, I just try to hang out with
Yeah,
people,
and yeah,
like, hey, let's do like a Bible study or something. Let's do this, let's do that.
it
And
wasn't happening.
yeah, it really wasn't happening. So
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, well, this is not going to work. But then I transferred Bob Jones. And
I mean, you certainly had friends at that
yeah,
time.
yeah, definitely
Um,
have some friends there.
were they friends that were pushing you in a clearly positive direction, or a neutral, or a negative direction?
Um, some I would say neutral.
Okay.
Sometimes it was positive, sometimes it was negative,
Mhm.
and it was difficult. Again, my relationship with God wasn't great
Mhm.
around that time, which I think definitely has a factor in it.
Yeah.
But when I transferred to Bob Jones with my friends, well, one of my friends, we became roommates down there, and it was very, very interesting. Had an RA, my friend Dan, thought he was weird in the beginning, but became very close. We made a Bible study,
Mhm.
started meeting. That was every Friday night. It was going very well. And with that, thinking about a relationship was starting to leave my mind
Mhm.
because I had the biblical community.
Okay.
And the more I had the biblical community and the more I was growing my relationship with God, wanting to get married, the desire for that was lessening. It was going down. Granted, do I still want to get married? I do, but that's not on my mind
Mhm.
often
Yeah.
as I'm living life.
So,
Yeah.
the more kind of solid spiritual biblical community you had, the more you grew, the more you found kind of fulfillment in that, as
Yeah.
opposed to seeking
Mhm.
it in a dating
Yeah.
relationship that God had clearly not opened up for you at that
Mhm.
point in your life. And so that's so important, right? If you're
Mhm.
single, struggling, and listen, some people are like, Doug, my church doesn't really have any people my age that
Yeah.
are single, right? Um, and so I used to work with our single young adults ministry when I became the youth pastor here back in 2003. Oh, Doug, you're going to work with everyone from sixth grade through their 20s, basically. It's like half the church felt like. And so I did a single young adult ministry, and there were some that were like, Doug, we're doing Bible studies and we've got Christian community, and this is really good. And I love our church and I love our group here, but man, I really would like to meet somebody. And I said, okay, well, how are you going to do that? They're like, I don't know. Calvary Church has this Bible study, and there's a lot of girls there. And I was like, then go to Calvary Church Bible study for a bit,
Mhm.
right? And we had a couple, find a, I know couple found wives at another church's Bible study, and brought them back to faith. And that was fine. I'd
Mhm.
say that's not a problem. There's Christian girl that's going to another church, another Bible study, and you happen to show up. Now, their motive was not, hey, let me dig deep into the word, although they did that. It was, I really want to meet somebody. So if there are Christian environments, I say this, if there's Christian environments where you can meet people either just for friendship, or you're looking to meet somebody for marriage, um, then avail yourself to those environments. That's fine. I don't think that's a problem. I don't think you're violating any scriptural principle,
Yeah.
or being unfaithful to your church or whatever. the covenant community is bigger than the local church, although we focus on local church community. But there are obviously other, I've known people who the online thing has worked out for them too. And there's some great Christian, platforms out there and apps that you can use for uh, finding someone. My own sister-in-law, my wife's sister, was single well into her 30s, and she tried everything. Went to this Bible study, went to this, dated here, dated. Just God never opened the door for her, and it was very clear. And then she just tried online dating again, and she met a guy who had lost his wife in a car accident, and like from the moment they met and started dating, it was like they knew that. Of course, they were older in life and had more experience. They weren't in like their early 20s. They had some life experience, and so they were ready to get married, and they did, and they've been married for a few years now, and God worked that out. So I would say find contentment in Christ, and one of the means to do that is through biblical community, and knowing you. Really, you also said personal walk, biblical community. If outside, and then the second thing I was going to say in relation to that, because we talked about it, and Paul mentions it here, is ministry.
Yep.
So how important is it, Andrew, for single Christian young people to be involved in ministry?
I mean, it's very important. I mean, we're all called to ministry in some way. We're all called to make disciples, share the gospel, and to glorify God. And I will say this, I was talking to someone about this, that if I were married right now doing youth ministry, would I be doing all the things I'm doing now? Probably not. I mean,
I'll give you an example. Right.
Yeah.
So you do a midweek Bible study on Wednesday nights, and then another Bible study is popped up with kind of like some senior high on Friday nights.
Yep.
So you're out Sunday night because you got youth group. You're out Wednesday night. And I know this because my son, who's a senior, is with you. And he comes home about 11 o'clock at night on Sunday night, on Wednesday night, and on Friday night. And if I came home past 11 o'clock at night, 3 nights a week, my wife would not be happy.
Right.
But it's really cool that you're able to do that, right? You have the ability to be like, hey, let's stay and study the Bible till 10 o'clock at night or whatever, 10:30. Or just hang out and build relationships with these seniors in high school and high school kids, because that's what you're called to right now. And so that the point is, God's given you a tremendous kind of opportunity to invest more without having to worry about someone back home who's waiting for you. Because I've known men who have given more to the ministry than their wife and children, and the results of that have been devastating. And so being married in ministry my entire time in ministry, I've had to walk that balance between commitment to what God's called me to. And there are seasons when it's more intense, and I have to tell Steph, hey, I'm not going to be around this week much because there's a lot going on and there's ministry requirements. But then there are opportunities to say, you know what, I've got to pour more into my family here because she's really struggling or my kids are going through something. And so the opportunity you have as single, I always say, don't waste your singleness. Even if you're going to get married one day, if you're not now, this is the opportunity that God's given you to invest more deeply and to spend more time impacting people. And so if your perspective is that, I'm lonely, I'm struggling with being single, but at the same time, I've got biblical community. At the same time, I'm pouring into people and I'm doing ministry. Then God's will is being accomplished through your singleness. So the point is, God has you single for a reason right now.
Yeah.
Right. And that reason is, as Paul says here in 1 Corinthians, to have attention that's undivided.
Yep.
And that's a powerful thing. And I don't think we celebrate that enough in the church. And so I wanted to ask you, how do you think the church as a whole, not just our church here, but the church as a whole, how well does the church do with helping single people or ministering to single people or making single people feel like they're part of the body?
Yeah. I mean, it depends on how you view church. So the big church, I would say, I mean, oh, what can they provide?
Hmm.
Well, I guess they can do this, can do that, but I don't really know. So definitely to help them with their gifts. Like what gifts do they have? And let's allow them to use their gifts. Because just because you're single doesn't mean you can't do anything. You're not effective for the ministry. I
Hmm.
mean, you're actually more effective to the ministry since you're
Yeah, on that
undivided.
point, when we were looking to hire, youth director, and we're interviewing different guys, and then you interview with us, I did have a couple people that were like, "Hey, he's single," and I'm like,
Right. Yeah.
"What's your point, really?"
Hmm.
And in fact, there was other opportunities that you had kind of pursued, looking for work too. That because you were single, that was against you,
Right. Yeah. So.
and and so. Um, And listen, I know for some people, for pragmatic reasons, are like, hey, we
Hmm.
want our youth pastor to be married because that gives him accountability with his wife, and
Hmm.
if he's really young and he's working with teenage daughters, those are all
Yeah.
fair points to be made, right? Like you have to build into your life extra layers of accountability that a married guy just naturally has because his wife is there, right? And so some of those things, ministry wise, I get makes sense,
Hmm.
right? If I'm with my wife and there's teenage girls around, my wife provides a layer of accountability, right? If you're
Hmm.
single, that layer of accountability isn't naturally there. So you have to build that in there.
Yeah.
So, and again, single married guys get in trouble with, girls too, but uh, there is a natural kind of accountability there when you're married that single people don't have. So there
Hmm.
is an admonition there as you do ministry, as you get close to people, that you have to be careful that there is accountability there. So I get all of that, but I think the greater point you're making is, well, just because I'm married doesn't mean I can't be a youth pastor, right?
Hmm.
I can't do discipleship. I can't do counseling. I can't, serve in missions. We work with Asafiwe Child Care Ministries in Uganda, Africa, and our um, the woman there that started that ministry, she's single, and she's kind of become a mother of a couple hundred kids almost,
Yeah.
that she's brought in, from the streets of Uganda and Entebbe. And so her being single, in fact, her story is one of using her singleness to move to Uganda, to be a teacher, to live there, and then to stay there and start a childcare, ministry that
Hmm.
takes in children. And so that's a powerful story of someone who's used her singleness to have
Yeah.
deep impact upon the world that she's in, and upon the poor and the homeless and the widows in one of the poorest parts of the world. And so definitely definitely seek ministry opportunities.
Yep.
And in seeking ministry opportunities, you find that God fills you, and then you also find community there too. So I think there's a balance between, hey, I like to your point, every young person that's single wants to hang out with other young, like they don't always
Yeah.
want to hang out with old married people. I get that,
Hmm.
right? Like, okay, are there people my age that are single that, and that's not wrong to desire that or want that. The only warning I would say to that is, if you're committed to a church, be committed to your church, and be faithful in that community, in accountability there, in service and
Hmm.
ministry there. But if you're looking for Christian community with other single young adults outside of that, that's fine.
Yeah.
That's fine. But don't start dating the church in a
Yep.
sense. This church has
Hmm.
more singles. This church has prettier girls.
Hmm.
This
Yeah.
church.
Right.
All of a
Right.
sudden, the church becomes about fulfilling your desire and
Yep.
your need to meet somebody. And that is not the purpose of the church. The purpose of the church is for God to accomplish His mission of going to the world and making disciples, right? And so, be careful if you're single about making the church about what you're gonna, find and get out of
Yep.
it. I mean, that admonition is for married people too, but specifically in the context of singleness. I've seen that with a lot of single young people. They'll
Hmm.
be at this church for a while and I didn't meet anybody, or I didn't find,
Hmm.
single young adults there. So, oh, this church has a great singles
Yeah.
program. So I'm going to go there, and then that doesn't work out. And then they're here and they're all over it. Just guard against that. Like,
Hmm. Yep.
go where God's called you, plant yourself where God's called you, be content there, serve, do ministry, do discipleship, pour into people. And if God calls you, if you want to get online and do online
Hmm.
dating, that works. I think I heard there's a the statistic is pretty high as far as people that find their spouse online anymore. I think it's upwards of over 50%.
Yeah.
And and I've seen God use that, and that's fine. I've seen God use, hey, I'm going to this Bible study where there's a bunch of single girls, and I've seen God use that as well. So that's fine, but don't make that. I guess what I would say is this: don't make that desire for marriage or companionship the sole focus.
Mm-hmm.
I've got to have this. I've got to have this. I've got to have this, because you can get tunnel vision as a single person, right?
Yep.
Where it's kind of like, this is all I'm looking at. This is all I'm after. Rather, put Jesus, the gospel, his mission at the center of your life. And then as God leads you, you can pursue, uh, you know, finding somebody or putting yourself in an environment where you could meet somebody. But if that becomes the center, then it becomes idol worship, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the desire for marriage, the desire to not be alone, at the end of the day, can become an idol of our heart. And I would just challenge singles, guard against making marriage an idol,
Mm-hmm.
and guard against thinking that, oh, if I can get married, then everything's going to change
Yep.
for everything's going to be better. All my loneliness will cease. All of my struggles will cease. Marriage isn't the fix for all of those things. I know that. In fact, marriage is very hard and difficult at times, and it requires a tremendous amount of commitment, tremendous amount of work. And Ron and I have talked about that in the past couple of podcasts. But for those who are single, if God's called you to singleness and you're content, then go for it. You don't have to get married. Be single and live for Jesus and impact the world in any way you can. Most people aren't, though. Most people don't
Mm-hmm.
have that gift, right? And so, for you, Andrew, do you feel like you have the gift of singleness, or do you see God one day kind of leading you down the
Right.
aisle for holy matrimony?
Yeah, I think I think that one day I will be married.
Mm-hmm.
But like we said earlier, as of right now, I'm not.
Yeah.
So just gonna do the ministry for
All
the
right,
Lord.
so I said that for all of the ladies listening, and all two ladies that might be interesting that are already married, but you might know somebody, and this is the other thing I wanted to ask you too, because sometimes the church is like, oh, you're single, I knew a great girl for you, or I can, you're
Mm-hmm.
single, I can set you up, and some people love to do that. What do you think about people who want to help single people get married? Is that a good thing, a healthy thing, or should they back off?
I mean, it is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes gets annoying.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, all right, I relax. I'm fine right now. Because
Yeah.
there's times where people are, oh, when can you get married? I'm
Yeah.
like, I don't know. I appreciate the offer,
Mm-hmm.
but it's like it's interesting. So you can do that.
Are most
You
single
do
young
that.
people open for like a married couple setting them up with, oh, my coworker or my cousin or whatever?
I mean, some people might be. I mean, me. I mean, I don't know. Part of me think it's a little weird, but part of me is like, yeah,
Well, you
I
never
don't care.
know.
You never know. 'Cause you never know,
Right?
right?
I'm not saying I have anybody, but
Yeah. Just throwing it out there, right?
someone listening might, right? So you never know.
Yeah, exactly.
This could be, Andrew, the start of God leading you. This podcast, who knows? The Black and White Theology
Black and White
Podcast could
theology,
be the
right?
start for you finding someone. We may get an email and be like, hey, I got somebody. So Ron and I will be on the lookout for that. So, well, on that note, we're going to wrap up this discussion and this topic, and where we're going next, I don't know. I've got to talk to Ron, and but hopefully he'll be back and here in the next a month or so, and we'll keep moving through. But again, if you have any questions or you have someone for Andrew, shoot us a message, send us an email, and we will move on from there. So until next time, have a great week.